Welcome everyone to In the Hot Seat. I am your guest host, Wendy Thacker, Vice President of Channel Marketing here at ScanSource. In the Hot Seat is our series of panel discussions with our suppliers about hot topics that are happening vertically. So this In the Hot Seat edition is going to focus on the public sector. And so we are excited to have some special guests here with us today to discuss that. So I will start by introducing from Axis, we have Kevin Taylor. Kevin is the Segment Development Manager of Cities in the Americas. Welcome, Kevin.
Oh, Wendy, thanks for having me.
Awesome. We also have Craig Cole with Cisco. Craig serves in the capacity of Senior Advisor, Public Safety and Cybersecurity. So welcome to Craig. And
Thank you,
also,
Wendy.
yes, and also Michael Sparks with Zebra. So Michael is Director of State and Local Government Sales. So gentlemen, I'm so excited to have you with us today. I'm going to just take a minute and let you guys kind of introduce yourselves, give a little bit of background about the role that you currently have with your supplier and where you touch public sector. So this is a really big market. So we have a lot of different ways that this conversation can go. So I'm going to start with Kevin from Axis.
Sure, Wendy. So thanks. Again, Kevin Taylor with Axis Communications. I'm the Segment Development Manager in cities or local government for our organization in the Americas. I'm with the organization for a little over 8 years and approaching 20 years in the physical security and low voltage security market. Within local government, we work really across all vertical segments of the public sector and private sector. So as well as education and Fed, DoD, but my focus again is local government. So within local governments, we look at 3 core areas where we feel that our IoT and video solutions yield really high value to local governments and municipalities in driving livability within their communities. And those 3 core subsegments are public safety, emergency response, transportation mobility, and environmental sensing and monitoring.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. So that is quite the extensive background. Congratulations. That is quite the accomplishment. We will move on to Craig. Good afternoon, Craig.
Good afternoon. So, Wendy, I'm in our state, local, and education business segment here at Cisco Systems. And obviously, as it says there, we look after state government and agencies, and then a lot of local governments and major municipalities, and of course, our education, both higher ed and K-12. Specifically, I focus primarily on the public safety and public safety enterprises and cybersecurity across all government entities. And in general, my team looks after not only kind of the core solutions and capabilities that governments need to provide services out to constituents, but also kind of forward-looking somewhat to help them manage and transition through a lot of these dynamic market changes we see happening right now and technical evolutions that are landing on their doorsteps that they're trying to figure out how to navigate.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a mighty large job. So we're excited to have you with us today as well. You guys are going to have some great insights. And finally, we'll flip it over to Michael Sparks. So Michael, give us a little bit of background on yourself.
Thank you, Wendy. So I've got responsibility for running our state and local government sales organization. And from Zebra's perspective, state and local government includes education as well, much like it does for Cisco. And for those of you who don't know who Zebra is, we provide the equipment and software, the solutions that help people connect assets and things, give them a digital signature, and then provide that information to folks in the field. So it's rugged handhelds, rugged tablets, rugged computers, as well as the printers and scanners.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. And it's great to have the 3 of you with us today. So a nice broad spectrum of what gets covered, which I think is terrific. So I'm going to just start off with some questions, and you guys are welcome to jump in. And as I had mentioned earlier, I may go off script, so you'll never know what I'm going to ask here. So we'll get started with this. We've seen a lot of shifts and changes and different things with COVID, the government, it's been really interesting. There's some ebb and flow with different purchasing that they do, etc. So you guys are focused a lot on state and local. So where are we seeing some of those dollars deployed, and what challenges are still out there from the different segments that you guys talked about that we're trying to address from a technology perspective, where we think we can be more productive or safer or more secure and streamlined?
One of the challenges we talk about and ask questions about state and local government is the number of kind of sub-verticals within state and local government. So there are different decisions driving technology decisions in the public safety side of the business, our first responders, our general administrative section of government, as well as the education side of the business. And from a public safety perspective, we're seeing a lot of technology being invested in two primary areas. One is putting information in the hands of our first responders, whether it's the law enforcement officer, firefighter, EMS tech, giving them the technology and equipment they need to have information in the field on the scene that helps them do their jobs better. And we're also seeing a lot of investment in giving their assets a digital voice. Especially from a fire department perspective, they use very expensive equipment and they don't want to leave it behind. They don't want to leave the firehouse without it. So having a good digital asset management system to make sure they've got the right tools at the right time is a key area of investment for public safety.
I think overall in the market, we're seeing, and it did kind of start with COVID as a bit of a catalyst, a significant number of changes. It kind of normalized remote work and work from home, which most people are probably familiar with. And that saw a rise in different ways to collaborate and have meetings like we're having now, and involve certain security concerns and changes in the way networks and connectivity were really being designed and put together. But one of the interesting things, I think, is we talk about government, but a lot of this change happened in the enterprise market space, and governments are having to deal with the fallout of that. So we kind of have these orders of impact that cascade, from a circle to a bigger circle to a bigger circle. And one example of that is we're seeing a massive transition of people in the way they work. So we're seeing a reduction in populations in the larger cities, and a mass migration to places, like the Austins and Nashvilles and St. Louis and Boise and Bozeman are seeing exploding growth in population. Now, what that does to government is we have a huge impact on the ability for those governments to provide housing and real estate. So we see a lot of change in the real estate market, both commercial and private, which is a lot of technology retrofits, which drives broadband access. We see government services in much greater demand. So agencies like motor vehicle departments and public safety agencies are under massive constraints to scale to new populations. So I think some of those trends, just a few examples, are what we're seeing as kind of those cascading effects of the changes in the market right now. And of course, we're all trying to help them manage through those transitions and grow or and scale along with it.
I think a lot of great points from both Michael and Craig on this. I'll start kind of piggybacking on something that Michael said about delivering data to our first responders. So we're seeing this emergence of what's commonly being called now real-time crime centers in a lot of municipalities. It's not a traditional security operations center or fusion center, but it is a location where data is aggregated into a central point, so that when, say, a 911 call comes into the public safety answering point, that at that point they begin to collect sources of data from other IoT devices, sensors, gunshot detectors, video cameras, things like that. So now they can deliver information real time to that first responder, in the hopes that of a few things. That number one, you can drive efficiencies in first response, and you can eliminate redundant tasks because they have the most current information and they're not collecting redundant data. But then the second thing is that, of course, driving safety for both the public that they're responding to and for the first responder themselves, which is a huge point in our society. There's been so much in the news recently about the challenges of interactions between public and police and law enforcement. So the more that we can equip these first responders with information so that they are well informed and know the environment that they're going into, that they can create a safe response for themselves and for the public they're responding to, then the better off everyone is.
Yeah, some really good points there, especially about the modernization of first responders. You're really seeing a lot of effort there, to your point, to get them better equipped to be able to handle situations. So all really interesting takes, fellas. And just a plug for South Carolina, where I'm located, I read a stat last week that we had the most new business license applied for during COVID. So Craig, we are definitely seeing the uptick in the housing market, stresses on the roadways and the different cities and different things. And so I know that cities locally are scrambling to try and get all of that in check as well. So really interesting points. Let's pivot for just a second over to security and connections. So when we think about cities and different state and local government agencies, we tie into a lot of utilities, with utilities and oil and gas and some of that being private, but then the security of those types of transportation lines or how they're flowing through on our highways or underground, et cetera. A lot of protection, whether it be cyber or on the ground, involved with that.
I think one of the things, and if we look at catalysts for change, when we saw COVID hit, and then we had a massive funding influx from the original ARPA funds, those two things together created a massive change in the way people worked and did business, and kind of made that normal. And I think we're right now on the cusp of a very similar, we're well into it, but I think there's even a lot more dynamic change to come around the infrastructure, and especially critical infrastructure protection in the country. We see a number of catalysts with the world events going on right now, of course. We can see them in the news every day, and the threat from those is becoming less physical and more cyber. Although I'd argue the physical threats are still there, just as they always were. The cyber threats are just increasing. And then we see the IIJA funding that's getting ready to drop, right? So just as an example, there's $1 billion specifically for cybersecurity for state and local government in there. I think another $500 million just for energy entities to harden their infrastructure. So when we see a top of mind public issue combined with a massive funding influx, that creates a lot of churn very rapidly in the market. So exactly to your point, we're seeing especially water, the electrical grid and transportation roadways starting to look at pretty aggressive increases in their ability to protect that infrastructure, specifically the IoT, as was mentioned a while ago, that Internet of Things, little components that we typically don't think of. So yeah, huge change underway, and I think a whole lot more change coming very rapidly, with a lot of folks trying to figure out exactly, how do I protect this? How do I have visibility into those elements that we normally don't think about as big technology components, and protect that critical infrastructure? And I'll pass it over to my colleagues for some more comment there. I'm sure I know they're both working in those markets as well.
They are. Michael, anything to add there?
Absolutely. So, and I appreciate what Craig mentioned from a cybersecurity perspective, and certainly we're seeing our utility operators looking at those outside threats. Mm-hmm. But they also have to worry about, and are very concerned about, maintaining the integrity of the systems, keeping them up and running. The threat may not be external, threat may very well be internal, and it comes down to making sure they've got great maintenance records, that they are getting the right piece of equipment repaired or maintained according to the appropriate schedule. So we're seeing a lot of investment in automating some of those processes and automating those workflows, putting equipment in the tech's hands so that when they go out to get a job done and they don't have that specific set of knowledge, that they can access it through a handheld or through a live video feed, and then making sure the records are kept up to date so they know where to apply the resources to protect the grid, to protect the infrastructure during these periods where they're getting more and more use.
But I think that if you look at say Department of Homeland Security recognizes, I believe the last number was maybe 18 different divisions of critical infrastructure that they identify as a particular sector. And they have a sector specific plan for each of those, which is a fairly broad scope document for each of those 18 sectors. But they reference both physical and cyber. And these plans have been in place for several years. They get updated. Each sector gets updated about every 3 years or so. And they started back in probably the mid 2010s of really emphasizing cybersecurity in some of these. It's a very significant risk. And I think we have to stop thinking of risk in terms of physical risk and cyber risk as two separate things. It all falls under the risk category, and it needs a comprehensive approach and solution to that. There are things that can be done. It strikes me, I don't mean to use the word humorous here because it's a more serious topic than that, but it strikes me as ironic that I hear some cybersecurity presentations even today in 2022, where people are talking about not using default passwords and credentials for devices. And I think, we've been talking about that for 15, 20 years. Haven't we moved past that? There are ways that you can source products that are secure by design, secure by default, that don't allow you to fire up the device unless you set a unique password that you have decided on within your organization. So there are things that can be done even to the hardware devices without putting yourself at risk of some of these really kind of remedial practices and ease of use. So yeah, these are really serious topics. The other challenge is I think we need to stop looking at IoT security in the same way that we look at general IT security. If you look at the IT landscape, you have less than a handful of major processor manufacturers, less than a handful of major operating system providers. So it's a very streamlined, best of breed approach. In IoT, you have literally thousands of processor manufacturers, thousands of operating systems. You have operating systems on some of these devices that are basically cooked up in someone's garage, and you don't know what vulnerabilities may lie within those. So managing your IoT and making sure you don't have shadow IT throughout your organization, that you see what's going on to your network, and that it falls within an appropriate IT policy of a chief information officer or chief information security officer, is all really critical, because the number of IoT devices is growing exponentially by the day. And we have to know what these devices are and what their authentication is.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point there. I think about going into the office. I go in with no less than 3 on a daily basis, but I just read a stat too that even talks about college students on average have 9 in their dorm rooms when they go to school.
Well, and we've seen it from a legislative standpoint as well, with the National Defense Advisory Act, that the federal government is beginning to recognize that some of these devices come from adversarial foreign governments, and we can't risk those falling on critical infrastructure networks.
Yeah, really interesting points. Thank you, Kevin, for that, and team. Switching gears a little bit, let me ask kind of a question that's a little bit off the beaten path, but when we look at some of the other verticals, we have some major labor shortages. So I look at retail specifically, hospitality specifically. We're really struggling to have the worker available to do those certain tasks. And so we've seen a lot of the technology that we sell be implemented from an efficiency and productivity standpoint. Do you guys also see that in the public sector space, where some of these items might be getting deployed because they have labor shortages, just like the commercial side of the house?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this. I think Craig mentioned earlier a way that he saw that the public sector was beginning to either feel some of the pain points or exhibit some of the characteristics that we've seen in the private sector in previous years and decades. And I think that holds true in terms of personnel, in terms of recruitment, onboarding, and retaining top-level talent. That there used to be a mindset within the American worker that, hey, I'm going to get on with a good organization, whether it be public sector or private sector, and I'm going to work for 30 years for that company and retire. And we just don't see younger generations doing that. They move from workplace to workplace. It costs an employer at minimum probably $25,000 to $30,000 to onboard and train a new hire. And that's in a relatively low to mid-level position. That's not even at a senior manager, director, high-level position. So some of the practices that we see in the private sector in terms of onboarding or recruiting, onboarding, and retaining your top talent is really critical. So that's something that local governments are faced with equally as much as private sector.
Wholeheartedly agree there. We were tracking the last NASCIO meeting, National Association of State CIOs, and that was of CIO concerns. The talent gap, question was the top concern. Talent gap in both state and local governments, and so it's, as we see the rate of technology change, increase, and the technologies become a little more complex and a little more in depth. Governments become more and more dependent on their technical infrastructures and clouds and data, as Mike was talking about. Then that talent gap becomes even more of a problem. Of the talent that's out there, I think state governments, and most especially your smaller local governments, have the biggest challenge because of the pay differential. So if you're graduating from a top university and you've got a couple of great industry certifications, those really top level talents are not typically looking, I think, Kevin, as you were alluding to spend time for 30 years at a small local government. They're looking for those higher paying, more dynamic, challenging careers. So it's a big challenge, I think, and it's the smaller your government is, the bigger the challenge is. So it starts in the smaller communities and works its way up. There are some programs, I think, to help it. We've talked to some states who are looking at doing some pretty innovative things with training in organizations such as ISOWs, which is the intelligence sharing private entities that are being started in many states, offering training and incentives for people to help them achieve that level of knowledge and then kind of stay in that state or local area and contribute to the community. But the talent gap is certainly one of the top issues we see right now.
I'm curious, Craig, do you think that, especially in some of these maybe secondary, tertiary market, smaller communities, do you foresee them filling some of these talent gaps by using professional services as opposed to onboarding personnel for each of these roles or tasks?
Absolutely. That's a great question, actually, because that's the logical conclusion that we're seeing as well. Had conversations just today on, as we spoke earlier about this infrastructure grant and the cyber rollout of that. How if you do provide that funding to a very small community who doesn't have the expertise to design and plan and implement and especially manage and maintain a very complex cybersecurity system going forward, then we expect that market to start to shift to two things. One would be cloud delivered services, where you just kind of subscribe to it and it's managed in the cloud, and your expertise really is maybe managing more of a dashboard than the technology itself. And the second is going to, in our case from Cisco, our partner community, and having a managed service provider maintain that technology for those local governments. So I think exactly right, Kevin. That's exactly where we see the market going, and we see that component growing pretty dramatically over the next couple of years.
Kevin, you mentioned something in our last little segment about things that are cooked up in a garage, and I've been amazed at the number of smaller communities that are their backbone. They're running their ERP system, if you will, was built on Fortran 30 years ago. Or they're still running on an AS400 that the lease may have ran out on 15 years ago. And so that older population now that built those systems as to operate them, they're retiring. And the younger folks coming in, they're trying to recruit, don't want to work on antiquated systems, or they don't have the skills to do that. And we're seeing that challenge drive a lot of communities to moving toward an outsource model, migrating from a legacy system to something that's newer and more modern. much more accepting of cloud-based services, because that critical knowledge is retiring and they can't replace it.
The last thing I'll add on it, because I see myself kind of fall into this trap sometimes as well. And I just want to clarify, we've made some comments across the panel about, certain governments, especially smaller governments, may not have the skill sets or the personnel or the expertise. I work with local governments daily, and I meet tremendously talented and intelligent people from communities of 3,000 to 5,000 up to 300,000 to 500,000. There are great people there, really talented, really devoted people. They just, for whatever reason, decided to put their life's efforts and their career into public service in the local government. There's still a challenge, though, in them having all of the resources, I think is what it is. And it's not necessarily an individual skill set or capabilities issue. It's the overall organizational structure and the resources that they have.
Yeah, very interesting point. Yeah, very, very interesting conversation, guys. You three are after my job. Y'all did a great job asking each other some questions here to wrap up. But I did want to thank you for your time today. I have been told that we are at time, so we didn't get to all the questions, but we might just have to have a round number 2 with this group, because you guys are super knowledgeable and have a lot of insight into the public sector. So thank you for your time today. We appreciate it. Have a great one. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you again for joining us today for In the Hot Seat, part of our Discover Opportunity Vertical Market Series. For more information, visit scansource.com/discover opportunity.